Today, we're talking Shakespeare, which is our bread and butter. That is where we came from, learning how to do this. One of the Coen brothers did a black and white...
Joel Coen, I checked.
Yes, he did a COVID project, basically, of cutting down Macbeth, adapting it to be even shorter, and adapting it for the screen for A24 and Apple. This weekend, they did one showing at 3 o'clock our time in an IMAX. It was a bunch of IMAXs across the country. There were even some international dates. So we got to see this thing early with a bunch of like-minded dorks. So yeah, this is an A24 movie, right? It is
our fave.
Extremely stylized black and white Shakespeare thing. They even have the dad from The Witch.
Oh, yeah. I was so glad he was in there. What's his name? Ralph Ineson?
Yes. He's the perfect A24 Lucky Charm. And he kind of does, like, pass the baton. Like, if you look at the Ralph Ineson cinematic universe, this is now...
the RECU.
This is now connected to The Witch and Green Knight. And I think
I was going to say, he plays the Green Knight in The Green Knight. And we did an episode on that, so you should go listen to that.
Yeah, that one was wonderful.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's in the first couple minutes of this, and he's great. But he is a good little talisman because this is very much in that line of folkloric, surreal, stylized, funky drama horror.
Yes, yeah. Usually when we see a movie or a play or whatever, we like immediately talk about it for like an hour afterwards. And this has been terrible. It's been like 2 days and we haven't said a word.
My first note is about Denzel Washington, who we haven't said yet. He plays Macbeth.
Oh yeah, and Frances McDormand is Lady Macbeth. Duh.
And then there are a bunch of other, if you know Harry Potter, Dudley's in there, Mad-Eye Moody's in there.
Yeah. And Mrs. Fig.
Mrs. Fig's in there.
Yeah, 3 Harry Potter actors got real excited.
And an actor that I love, who I saw at the Royal Shakespeare Center twice, he's in this too, but we'll talk about him a little bit later.
Okay, well, let's talk about Denzel. What did you think?
Well, I've seen him in a bunch of things, but I haven't, and I looked it up, and he has done a bunch of Shakespeare before. I just haven't seen it.
That's cool, like on stage?
I think he was in that Much Ado About Nothing with Keanu Reeves.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen that.
From the 90s.
Right.
Yeah, Emma Thompson.
I've always been more into the tragedies, Shakespeare-wise. And I was excited to see what he was going to do with it, because I love seeing great American actors jump at Shakespeare.
Me too, because the Brits gatekeep it so much, which I understand. But
there's also, I mean, there is like a house style for great British stage actors.
Right.
Where it is very performed and involved in like scenery chewing, dramatic. And I really loved what Denzel Washington did with the character. There was a great minimalism to his performance where there was
minimalism.
He wasn't like an exploding volcano, screeching and thrashing around the whole time. There was a coldness to him, which I think is part and parcel in making the characters older in this version.
I did really like that choice.
Because he can't be a hothead. He has to have survived so long in this like lieutenant position.
He can't be this young 20s guy like really trying to go for it.
And him becoming like getting Gloms and Carter at the beginning, that is a promotion for him, which means he really was middle management his entire life.
Yeah,
and this is the first time he's shining. So there is that like cold, compressed quality to him where he has had to swallow his thoughts and feelings for most of his life.
Yeah.
And you see that early on when he's interacting with just Duncan when they're alone. He's very...
Duncan is the king for people who need to...
Who is his boss, basically.
Yeah.
He's very quiet and respectful and warm to him. And then you see him with Lady Macbeth when she starts to develop this plot to start killing people. And she seems like a lion. And he seems very subdued, almost like subordinated. And he has a discomfort at what she's suggesting, but he like doesn't let himself get mad at it. He doesn't really react to it. There's a muted quality at the beginning of the movie.
Yes.
And I was fascinated by his line delivery because Macbeth is one of the shortest Shakespeare plays. And this version shortens it up even more. The movie's still, I think, an hour 45, but if you pull out credits and all of the like wide shots and landscape things, there is less of the text than there is traditionally.
Yes.
And it's already a very short and extremely famous play. And most of the most famous moments and lines are Macbeth speaking.
Yeah.
So for an actor, there are these like, every 10 minutes, there's a signpost moment where people in the audience are recognizing the line and saying it in this big, convoluted, dramatic way in their heads. And he almost, I wrote it as his line delivery, he had like a rolling style. where he just kind of blew through a lot of the lines. There weren't big dramatic breaks in between lines of dialogue.
Right.
It very much, maybe for the first time since I've seen Macbeth performances, it felt like thoughts in someone's head. It didn't feel like someone performing a character's thoughts. I loved that rolling delivery. I'd never seen it before. It feels very American, and it was really a fresh take, because even the scene after Lady Macbeth dies, which is his most famous monologue, he kind of like rolled through it really quick. Like it was kind of offhand, and his mind was racing. I just thought that was a fascinating interpretation.
It was interesting. I'm sorry to say, my least favorite part of this movie was Denzel Washington's performance.
No.
I loved this movie except for that. I don't know what, I think he's a great actor, and I don't know. I had a really hard time with his performance. And you're right, it was this rolling way he delivered the lines, but to me that just felt like I could see him acting out the lines. Like I could see him, I memorized the script, teacher. I know all the words. Like I don't know if it was his choices or if it was the directing or what, but I was not on board. I didn't believe him at all. I was really disappointed by his performance. I was not a fan at all.
I feel like there are a lot of Macbeth performances where it's 2 hours of Hamlet holding the skull.
I mean, it didn't have to be that. I didn't feel like it worked with the rest of the movie.
Well,
especially because like Lady Macbeth's performance, or Frances McDormand's performance is so like, not that it's not the Great British like spitting on stage acting. Yes. But I believed her so much. She was so intense. And yeah, Lady Macbeth is a more intense character than Macbeth, but Macbeth is still an intense character. And you're right, like when Lady Macbeth dies, he was just kind of, well, I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about acting like as a craft, and like I guess I'm not the best expert to talk. You've taken one class, calm down. But and you've been voice acting. That's true. I don't have much ways to articulate it. I really didn't like his performance. I thought everybody else was excellent.
So when
Macduff was not my favorite either. See, there's a lot about this movie that was understated, which was good. But like when Macduff finds out that his family dies.
Ooh. That's my favorite moment.
It just sounds like he's reciting poetry. It doesn't sound like he's having an emotional reaction.
It was not the best performance of that scene I've ever seen.
No, and I don't know.
Okay, so let me make the argument here.
Yeah.
I think the intensity of Denzel Washington's Macbeth was in how muted he played it. Because most of the shots in this movie, there were some like wide shots with blurry backgrounds, but it was so surreal that wasn't the point. It was like the outline of a castle in the background.
Yeah.
90% of this movie is constant tight close-ups and character work.
Yeah.
And I thought so much of him being that like muted, repressed middle management kind of, old man Macbeth, it meant that you were seeing things play out on his face more. So I was studying the smaller movements, and I enjoyed that.
No,
because then you know how Macbeth ends. You know that it ends with sword fights and death, but on the road to him saying things like him having scorpions in his mind, I'm always interested to see how quickly the ramp up happens. And
that's the thing is, I didn't see that happen with him at all.
Oh, I did.
I didn't see him really change much. I just saw him reciting lines. I don't know how to. I just didn't believe it.
I thought there were the first like half hour of the movie felt very old Hollywood because the style of black and white was such minimal sets and extreme lighting. I have much to say
about the sets. I'm very excited. We can get there.
Everything. When it wasn't an extremely climactic scene, like him and Banquo meeting the witches, that was much more dramatic. The lighting, the color, it was more dramatic. But a lot of the other like interim dialogue scenes were a very soft gray that felt like old Hollywood.
Yeah.
Felt like little clips you see online.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really smart swap. Instead of trying to evoke Elizabethan England, I mean, they did that basically with the clothes, but I'm
sorry, I have so much to say about that. No, Can we come back to that?
Yeah, I just mean they didn't go for my least favorite version of Macbeth, which is like vaguely military, where everyone's kind of in like a military costume.
Oh.
Everyone's in some sort of uniform with the little bars and the hats and things.
Are you talking about like the Patrick Stewart movie adaptation? What do
I've
you
seen
mean?
a lot of them like that,
Okay.
where it's like vaguely ahistorical but militaristic.
Okay.
And I thought this was more fun because it was kind of abstract.
Yeah.
And again, I thought that prioritized the performances and the quiet character work.
It did. Yeah. I just wish that.
I think it was a subtle performance, but when it did ramp up, I was really impressed with it.
To me, it looked like when a high schooler does Shakespeare for the first time and they just like, and they're like,
That's so disrespectful.
But that's what it was like. It was like, oh, well, it was like the cadence to his voice didn't apply to the words he was saying. It was just, I memorized all these lines. I got to make them sound serious. I don't know. I had a tough time with him.
I thought he sold the subconscious of the character.
It felt like overdone and underdone at the same time.
Well, there are moments that are huge reaction shots to big things happening.
I know,
and then there are moments thinking of a plan.
I liked him walking down the hall, seeing the knife in front of him, the dagger in front of him. That he did a really good job there. I really liked his performance there. But just everything else, I didn't believe it. And that was so disappointing because the rest of the movie was so good.
I feel like I know what you're saying.
And I've seen him be really good before, and I like him as an actor. And so I was like, what happened to you?
I think I kind of know what you're saying, even if I don't agree with it, because I saw an Antony and Cleopatra at the Globe. Mm-hmm. And
this is an episode where you just brag about all the Shakespeare adaptations
it's
you've
not.
seen.
It's just part of, it's been my life for like 10 years.
Let me make fun of you. It's fun.
Yeah, but I mean, this is all I can contribute in life. So,
sure.
Yeah, I do get to brag.
Great.
And I'm good at it. So it's good to know the things that you have competency in.
All right.
So it was Antony and Cleopatra, and the number one interpretation they'd made, like apart from the weird sets, which I didn't really care for either, was that Antony was an idiot. And Cleopatra was this big conniving politician.
Yeah.
And Antony was a bumbling fool, which doesn't make any sense to me because he's supposed to be the strategist and the military commander.
Right.
I'm not going into the play. I just mean it's supposed to be like a cat and mouse game usually. Mm-hmm. And I sit the way I sit.
Scoot your butt back.
No, I'm happy like this.
You look so uncomfortable.
But I didn't like that he played it so off.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what you're saying about Macbeth.
It was just, and I'm all for different interpretations of Macbeth because I'm used to seeing a very dramatic British Macbeth, and I was fine with changes, but this, I don't know. I just had a hard time with it.
So before I get into the text, why don't you talk about all the things I just touched on?
Yeah, sure. So I did read that I think Joel Coen, it might have been him who said this. So the whole setting, like all the sets, everything takes place on soundstage. Mm-hmm. Even though there are exterior shots, it's not actually outside. It's all inside.
There's one.
Which one?
The end shot.
What's the end shot?
Everything else was on a soundstage.
What was the end shot?
Look who didn't read the IMDb trivia.
I did read the IMDb trivia. That's all I saw.
They said there's one shot exterior.
Well, what's the last shot, Cam?
I don't know. When he's walking up with Macbeth's head.
Okay, well, whatever. Point is, I think Joel Coen said it was designed to be untethered from reality, which makes a lot of sense with what we're saying. Like it's this like kind of dreamy, hard to tell what's real and what's not. Like it's very bright whites. Everything's very blown out and foggy, and you can't really see much, like more than 5 or 10 feet ahead of you. And the sets are super minimal. Costumes are minimal in some ways. Like when Macbeth says like, "Give me my armor," they give him like a breastplate and that's it. Like it's all very minimal and it feels like a play. That's why I liked it a lot. It didn't feel like a film adaptation of this story and we'll just put it all on film sets and it's going to be a movie, like a historically accurate movie. It was like, this is a play made for the screen. Does that make sense? Like that's how the sets felt to me. Did you agree with that?
I mean, isn't that in service of the project?
Yes. No, I liked that a lot. I'm saying that was a cool choice. I loved it.
I mean, comparing it to the other black and white movie that I know well, which is The Lighthouse, which is a very different kind of surrealism. I think that one's more grounded.
It's much more grounded.
They built all the sets in The Lighthouse too, but they feel much more earthy and real and grounded.
Right. Whereas these felt like sets.
It felt like an abstract painting.
It was very conceptual and impressionistic.
Which is the sweet spot.
Yes. It wasn't like like they're inside a castle for most of the play. Occasionally they're outside, or in the movie, I should say, they're inside like different rooms in this castle. And they didn't like go like build a whole ass castle and like build a huge dining hall and like a bed chamber. Like there's hardly any furniture except what's needed for the scene, like a bed or a table or a chair. But it's like, and there's no decoration on the walls. There are hardly any props. There's no like tapestries or paintings. It's all very like bare bones. And I really liked that. I always liked that in Shakespeare because I think the script is so good and the acting should be what takes center stage. And obviously that's what we just talked about is what's happening here. But I think my favorite part, and this is my own personal preferences and biases, was the vaguely medievalness of it. Because as we were watching, like if you watch this film, which you should, you'll notice there are pointed arches all around. And that's a very like standard medieval architectural feature, right? And like it's the pinnacle of Gothic architecture. It's why Gothic architecture exists. Pointed arches are very medieval in like our 21st century Western brains. But there are different types of pointed arches. Like in that circular room where Macbeth and Lady Macbeth spend a lot of time, there are all those like little doorways that are these like very steep, simple, narrow pointed arches.
Okay.
But then there are a couple where they're much wider and kind of more curved, almost in like an OG arch or a Tudor arch, which is just, I mean, I can't describe it to you. Just fucking look it up. Google it. Just search OG arch or Tudor arch. But it's a very different type of pointed arch, which becomes popular in Europe much later than like your standard regular pointed arch. Again, it's like they're not trying to cement it in a certain period of time.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that I was like, when did Macbeth... So Macbeth is a historical figure, right? And I was like, when was he actually alive? Macbeth reigned from 1040 to 1057, which is much earlier in the medieval period than this story appears to take place. And you can tell that mostly from the pointed arches because those aren't really seen on that scale in Europe until like the 12th and 13th centuries.
Yeah.
And so if Macbeth is living in the 11th century, that architecture is much like heavier, clunkier. There's like rounded arches. You would call it Romanesque is what we would call it.
There were some rounded arches. I felt like, I mean, the light was so strong that I felt like I could see the shadow and the shape of the arches constantly on the ground.
Well, exactly. Like, and I realized like the pointed arches stand out because they're better looking and just because they are meant to be visible. They're beautiful. But so there is like even though there are these pointed arches everywhere, it's still very like heavy and thick and clunky in terms of like how thick the walls are. And also they're in a castle, which is less delicate and beautiful than like church architecture. Sure. It's more practical. But this combination of these random types of pointed arches that show up all over Europe at different times and this like clunkier, more early medieval architecture, it's not meant to take place in a certain year. They're not at all trying to be historically accurate. They're just wanting you to get the impression and for it to look and feel medieval to this 21st century Western audience and not necessarily like this is taking place in this one certain year. Yeah. And it's not in that like Renfest way where it's like where it's just inaccuracies all over the place and it's higgledy-piggledy and it's not cemented in anything.
Ye old Shakespeare.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can't even get into Renaissance is not even medieval. I can't even get into it, but
well, it's all turkey legs, right?
Yeah, right. Like it's very intentional and reserved and restrained. Like and that's what the costumes are like too. Like, and I'm not as well versed in costumes and the history of dress, but like
I am. I wore a bodice to the movie.
Is that right? Did you?
A little Oktoberfest.
You wore one to the wedding too. It was super sexy. But like they just, you can tell the silhouettes and like the hairstyles are vaguely medieval, but it's not tied to anything specific. Like it's just, they did just enough where you believe the world they're in. And that's kind of where it ends. And also like there was no consistency in accents. Like Denzel was doing a full American accent, which I didn't have a problem with. It was just his other choices I didn't like.
So was Frances McDormand.
Yeah, she was doing like a vaguely British, but just like proper American, really.
I didn't think there was any Britishness in it.
Yeah, I mean, no one was doing a Scottish accent. Like no one was even bothering.
No, which it was weird at the end when they said like King of Scotland.
Yeah, I was like, oh, funny. We're supposed to be in Scotland.
Yeah.
But also like that didn't matter.
But on the record, Shakespeare is always better when you let people do their native accents.
Exactly.
Because there's enough to worry about with the dialogue.
Well, and that's what, I mean, yeah, because Shakespeare is so, like, it deals with so many universal concepts that even if he's like telling this story about this specific point in 11th century Scotland, that's why it's taken place in 8,000 different settings and 8,000 different adaptations. Like, it doesn't matter.
And I think Macbeth is one of the most universal Shakespeare plays because, and I'm not saying everyone relates to murdering their boss and wife and all that.
Right. No, but that's pretty specific.
It sets up these thought experiments that demand an opinion. Every scene provokes a really strong, like, oh, now he's trying to murder a kid. You have a reaction to that. And because it's only 90 minutes and it's studded with all these gorgeous images of witches and daggers and murders, you are involved and invested and upset through so much of it. I just think it is an incredibly human and involving play. Right. Every time I've seen it in every version. And this did that with that blown out sort of surreal abstraction sort of way. But that, if anything, that invested me more because there was a mystery to everything. Right.
It's like it was pulled away from reality enough that it felt dreamlike and not part of our own reality. And it feels like a thought experiment, but the attention to detail with the sets and the costumes, it's like it's just real enough that you believe it in a dream sense and not necessarily in a real world sense.
Yeah, let's linger on that for a moment.
Okay.
One of the things I look for when I see new Shakespeare now, because I think good Shakespeare doesn't ever try to dumb it down for the audience, because audiences are smart. They're just as smart now as they were 400 years ago when this was written for the peasants and the working class and everyday people. It wasn't this elite opera house fuddy-duddy thing.
Ivory tower, wasn't any of that.
Which is how we look at it now, but that's wrong. And I don't think you need to do that. The universality does bleed through. So the things I look for are belief in the text, where it doesn't change it or try to baby it down like that, but also what they do in between the lines. The moments between the words, which, I mean, this is a visual medium. What are the visual flourishes you can do that add characterization, or in some cases, if they have a strong grasp of the text, comment on it? So I made a list of a couple of those.
Okay.
There's a scene where Lady Macbeth is holding her head in like a scene of great stress and tension, and she pulls her hand away and some hair comes out.
Oh, yeah.
And she doesn't react.
Yeah.
So it's a silent thing. It's not adding anything to the text. It's kind of cheating, it's throwing in a moment of characterization in between the lines, but it very much develops her character because she's that far gone that she's not reacting to it. It's almost like she expects that to happen. Like, of course I'm falling apart at this stage of the play. Another one was when Macduff's family is killed. You see his son being thrown into the fire.
Yeah, right.
Which is much more visceral and violent than that is usually described. Usually it's a gesture with the wife and the son, and then the real terror of it is the description to Macduff later.
Right, yeah.
But here, there were two rounds of it. You saw the horror, and then you saw it hit him like a tidal wave.
They showed all of the murder in this adaptation. A lot of times, because it's not in the dialogue, it's very, I don't remember how overt it is in the text of like, does it say whether or not it has to happen on stage?
I've never really seen it this explicit.
Yeah, like usually it's off stage or you hear it or something, but this, like, we saw him stab Duncan in the neck. We saw
the point is
Banquo run through with the sword,
Especially with Macduff's family, it usually is left a little bit more ambiguous so that there's more of a dramatic reveal to him later.
So that we feel it with Macduff. Right.
And they're in like kind of jumping the gun and spoiling it there. I feel like the movie had a great patience. You need to be confident with Shakespeare because people do view it as this inaccessible thing. You have to know it. The actors have to know it. And they have to present it really clearly. I even thought, I know you didn't like Denzel Washington's performance, but I thought he hit a lot of the plot points clearly to keep the audience informed. I thought he did a really, really good job at signposting that.
I feel like he didn't. Like that was one of my big problems was I feel like he was just vaguely being dramatic. He wasn't like leaning into the specifics of the actual lines. I don't know.
Well, there are also... There are so many moments because it's a short play. There are also a lot of short scenes. There are a couple big ones, but it's also an unusual number of short scenes for Shakespeare. And there were multiple points that felt like ad breaks. on network TV, where the scene would fade to black or fade out.
Yeah.
And then while the screen was still black, you would get the next line of dialogue from the next scene. But you would have these little moments to catch your breath.
Yeah.
And
I do like
or it
that.
would linger on this like gorgeous zoomed out oil painting of a shot, you
Yeah.
know, where Lady Macbeth is looking over the edge of a cliff or something.
Yeah. Well, that's why this feels like a play, is a lot of times scene transitions on the stage are done like that, where you're focused on something else visually on stage while a set is changed or different actors come on stage.
But usually I feel like movie versions get rid of those.
Because they're like, well, we don't need this. We can just cut.
But I think they're essential to the understanding of the story because they allow you a moment to digest what has just happened.
Right. It's written so that there are those pauses.
Exactly. It's digestion. It's something in between courses of a meal. And the uneasiness builds. If something scary just happened and you're about to jump to another character who doesn't know what's coming, that one moment of lingering heightens that tension. And this adaptation absolutely understood that.
Totally. Yeah.
Last thing, as a visual flourish, the witches.
I was going to say, can we talk about the witches? Because they're so cool.
I only really have one thing to say about them.
Okay.
This version of the witches, highly physical.
Very
I feel
physical.
like usually they, because there are three and they're kind of ghosting in and out of the scene and talking in these weird, you know, rhythmic ways, usually they're very ethereal, spooky and elderly. Here, very much elderly, but extremely spry and physical and like a contortionist. Or they would move around the scene as these birds who, again, weren't just like ethereal, spooky crows or anything, omens in the background. They were actively pestering people.
Yeah, right.
I've never seen such physical witches in a version of
Macbeth.
Macbeth.
It was so interesting because we've just been saying the whole feel of the movie is very ethereal, dreamlike. You don't know what's real, so much fog. And they do play with that with the witches. Like, you believe that only Macbeth and Banquo could see them. Like, because it plays a lot with, because it's just one actress. It's Catherine Hunter, who plays Mrs. Fig in Harry Potter. It's just her. And she usually is like playing one, and you like kind of see glimpses of the others, and they play around with that. But when it's on her, she feels so real and visceral, and she's like doing these weird positions with her body, and she's like, or she's all up in someone's face. Like, she felt more real and in your face than a lot of the other stuff going on in the movie. So that like adds to like Macbeth's like real fear of her or of them as well as Banquo.
Because she was such a presence.
Totally.
That she almost lingered even when she wasn't on stage anymore.
I loved the beginning when it's like her, it's just her, but then you see the reflections of the other two in the water.
Yeah, it's like a wide shot of her standing in front of a puddle, and when it cuts back to her, there are two more standing next to her in the reflection.
It's one of the coolest things I've ever seen.
It's fantastic.
It was so beautiful.
Yeah.
And I loved, I want to talk a bit about them when they're up in the rafters in that potion sequence.
Sure.
So that's the double boil and trouble scene. So they're up in the rafters, and it's like
the witches.
Yeah, again, it's that circular room I was talking about before, and like up above, it's like an open skylight, but there are these like in like a tic-tac-toe crisscross pattern. It's like these wooden beams.
Yeah.
And so they're up in there. And I loved that sequence, not only like with the potion that's just this puddle of water around Macbeth and all of that. Like, that was all very surreal and dreamlike and very cool. But the rafters themselves are so like angular and square, which contrasts so much with the like elegant long lines of the pointed arches of like the windows around that room. And so it makes the witches like feel more unsettling and more unnatural, because those aren't like organic shapes, and like it mimics like those weird positions she's putting her body into in that first scene, and those like crisscrossy, like right angled, harsh lines of the rafters, I thought was a really interesting choice. I liked it a lot.
Because the witches have such an otherworldly, transcendent power and knowledge, sort of hanging above the play and then descending like spiders to ruin it every couple scenes.
Yeah.
Them standing on the rafters like that, tinkering with and kind of torturing Macbeth, that felt to me like the catwalk above a stage.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you're so right.
That's felt
so cool.
very theatrical, but in like you've got to scratch the surface a little bit to get it. It wasn't obnoxious.
Right.
It was
wasn't
just there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you're right. Like, I liked that she was old. Like, often when we think about witches, they're either beautiful, young, sexy women, or they're nasty old crones. And they leaned into the old woman thing very much. And that makes a lot of sense because witches, especially in the medieval era, are depicted as being like masculine and ugly and old and not beautiful. Like this woman was almost androgynous, especially because she plays an old man when she's rescuing Banquo's son and like hides him in that hut. What do you think?
I don't know.
She's just a bearded woman?
No, I just don't know if that's how I'd characterize her role with Fleance.
I don't mean the old man archetype.
No, I know.
I just mean an elderly man.
I just don't think she was rescuing Fleance.
Whatever she's doing.
Okay.
My point
we'll get there.
My point is she's androgynous.
Yes,
that's
she
my
was.
point.
Yeah.
And in the medieval period and for a long time after, usually women, old women were the ones who were accused of witchcraft because they're like these marginal members of society, and often like they're very dependent on others in society because they're widowed or whatever, and they don't have a husband or a father to defend them, so they're easy to accuse. So that makes a lot of sense. I was also just digging in a tiny bit, and I learned that in Scotland specifically, there were, in 1563, the Witchcraft Act was passed in Scotland, which made it practicing witchcraft or associating with witches was like a capital crime. And so there were a lot of witch trials in the late 16th century, aka Shakespeare times.
Almost.
No, not almost. Late 16th century, that's full Shakespeare.
Yeah, but later than that. Later in the 60s. It was right about turn of the century.
You mean 1600s? You said 60s. I'm just clarifying.
No, it was right about the turn of the century with Shakespeare.
Well, right, but I was going to say there were major trials in Scotland in the 1590s.
Okay.
And Macbeth is supposed to be written between like 1599 and 1606.
Yeah.
So like this obsession and fear of witches is very prevalent. And I don't know how much Shakespeare was hanging out in Scotland, what he knew about it. I don't really know how this connects to England so much, especially if he's down in London. But
spending time with Gwyneth Paltrow,
of course. But just the fascination with witches and the inclusion of them in such a pivotal way makes a lot of sense here. So that was very cool to see.
Sure.
I think my favorite part of the movie was her performance. I can't remember her name. Sorry, Catherine Hunter. I thought she was incredible. Yeah. So cool. Loved it so much.
So let's jump into some more textual stuff now.
Okay.
I was trying to give myself like little prompts so I could marshal my thoughts on this.
Yeah.
And the question was, what angle does this version take on the text? What is my main takeaway from this rendition of the story that I think everyone kind of knows?
Yeah.
And what I got was prophecy is poison.
Sure. That's great.
Because it opens so strong on Macbeth and Banquo receiving the prophecy from the witches. Mm-hmm. And at first, I feel like both performances from Banquo and Macbeth, the discomfort and the pressure to live up to that. What does that mean? Why is Macbeth going to be king, but why are Banquo's sons and he's not? And like the prophecy, it really does rattle them. Mm-hmm. And then as things start to fall in line with the prophecy, it goes from a pressure to perform and live up to it to the absolute powerlessness as the prophecy becomes inevitable. Mm-hmm. And they start to live down to it. Mm. And Macbeth is then ordering the murder of his friend and his friend's son.
Yeah.
And it's the effect of prophecy in the same way, like you can't really tell anyone anything. You can't tell someone what to do in a difficult situation because they either have to get there on their own or they're going to handle it differently. Yeah. So even if you have what you think is the perfect solution that'll get them through it, it just doesn't work like that. Mm. And that impotence is maddening. Mm-hmm. I thought this escalated that point by like flirting into the supernatural of it actually being a prophecy and that prophecy is poison.
Sure.
It drives Macbeth mad, especially with that restrained, like Banquo's ghost dinner scene, which I've seen played as a moment of comedy, and I think that works amazing. But it is a great moment of drama too. Usually it's Macbeth can't sit down at the table because he sees this projection of Banquo's ghost there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And here they didn't do that.
Right. They just had like this raven fly by. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Here it's a bird, and it's one of the witches.
Yes.
It's that bird.
Yes.
The bird like flies by the doorway and pulls Macbeth out into the hall. So he chases the bird down through his own castle. And it's not him being haunted at his hearth and table and in his own house. Yeah. It's just like this outrage of, how is this guy still alive? Someone just told me he was dead.
Right. Like, it's not even his own, because it's so easy to make that scene his guilt, and he's being haunted by that, which I think is a great interpretation. But to change it like that is really interesting.
It's a really strong change because, like I said, it's the absolute powerlessness as prophecy becomes inevitable. The scene is not played as a manifestation of his guilt, where he has like the ghost of Christmas past hanging out in his seat.
Right.
It's not that. It's disobedience. It's, I hired people to kill you. They told me you were dead. Now you're still here. He's pissed.
It's anger. It's desperation. That's... Go ahead.
No, exactly. It's an unsuccessful kill. It's his plan falling apart. And again and again and again, it's that impotence and frustration, which does sell much better with an old Macbeth.
Exactly. I was going to say that was one of the things I loved about this interpretation with both him and Lady Macbeth is this version of this play is not about ambition. Usually that's what Macbeth is supposed to be about. It's overly ambitious, flying too close to the sun, whatever. This is more about desperation, because when Lady Macbeth is 25, she's really like ambitious and driven and like wants to get stuff done and wants to rise, and then Macbeth easily follows along. In this version, when they're in their 60s, it's like you were saying, Macbeth's been right in the middle for so long, and it just becomes desperate, and like Frances McDormand's performance is so desperate and so like almost sad, but like frightening at the same time. It's really great. I like that change a lot.
Young Lady Macbeth usually feels like the woman behind the man, the like young politician's wife who's driving him the whole time,
and almost the femme fatale.
Yeah, here it's frustration, but it highlights how scheming every character is. If you have the witches constantly flexing on Macbeth, showing their superior will, and that their agenda constantly wins out, it makes like lesser schemers like Macbeth feel even more powerless. And it's very much like a Dr. Faustus thing, where it's a guy who is an advanced theologian and scholar who's old. Like the Faustus character is supposed to be 60 basically, which at that time was pretty much the end of your life. So the point was he had done absolutely everything he could do in academia and mortal thought. And he'd written everything he could. He'd read every book he could. And now the only thing left to plumb through was the supernatural and the afterlife. And that's why he makes that deal.
Yeah.
But the second the demon shows up when he tries to conjure it, he knows, shit, all of this is real. I'm now screwed. That that confirmation that everything in theology is true in the play, that ruins him. And here, Macbeth, it's almost like a dog with an invisible fence. It's every time he tries to run too far in one direction, he's pulled back by the collar. And those shocks going off, it starts to make him feel like the walls are closing in, that he can't move anywhere in any direction, or something is going to overpower his will. It's that same kind of impotence, but it's not played through theology like it is in Faustus.
Right.
It's played with this surrealism and the flirtation with the supernatural. It's really affecting here.
Yeah.
And the breaking point in that sort of subconscious torture is also the breaking point in Denzel Washington's performance here, where he starts to light up. And stop being this like muted, frustrated, kind of controlled guy.
You're saying like when the Raven comes in as Banquo's
No,
ghost.
it's just after that. It's Lady Macbeth's death, I think, is the moment of escalation there, where he goes into this. He's already been what I called like ice cold, which is that like detachment of his own kind of middling success and failure.
The whole movie feels cold.
But
it's great.
He escalates into this coldness of what I wrote in my notes as don't give a fuck old man detachment.
Yep.
Where he starts just murking people. I mean, the murders are so stylized.
Yeah.
Where he spits blood in a guy's face, takes his dagger, keeps walking by him, and just like shicks it back in the guy's neck.
Yeah, it's very cool.
It's so, and like me describing that, you'll still be so shocked when it happens.
Yeah, right.
Because it's so fluid, and he doesn't move a muscle in his face. He just keeps, like he's had this ability, but he just hasn't risen to it.
Like Walter White.
Yeah, like he's giving it the oxygen that it needs, but it flares up so easily and naturally in him.
Yeah.
And that's when you get those cold murders. That's when you get him howling. And even his death is this like quick, detached, angry kind of thing.
Yeah.
And when he's fighting Macbeth, or Macduff, sorry, the guy who kills Macbeth at the end, instead of having it be in this like open battlefield in front of the castle, which is usually how it's portrayed, or at the top of the castle.
Yeah.
Here it's on this skinny little like rampart.
Yeah.
Attaching a building
I
to the
loved
main
that.
castle.
I thought that was a really cool choice. I loved that.
Oh no, me too. Because their fight is so much more visual. It's so much more colorful in this tiny little corridor because you can see the detached, let the other guy like get all of his energy out and then quietly stab him in the neck as you walk by him. He goes from that to finally snapping and being angry.
Right.
And him as the old man with a heavy sword fighting angry in a tiny corridor. The thing that like sparks that final escalation to him finally being like the angry growling Macbeth is the way that this version plays the no man of woman born. And Macbeth's reaction to that is not, oh shit, there's a rule I missed in the genie contract from Aladdin. It's not that. It's really, there's a loophole.
Yeah, he's like so pissed about it.
Yes, it enrages him. It doesn't inspire fear. It enrages him as if he's losing on a technicality.
Right.
That's why he fights angry. It's that same impotence.
Right, and it's fighting in that tidy corridor on the rampart. You can see them both, like Macduff and Macbeth, like so frustrated with their inability because you're fighting with long swords. It's two-handed. You need a lot of space, and they don't have the space, and so it's just this like claustrophobic, like tense, frustrated. I don't have enough space. Like it's so like angry and pissed and old man. It's really good.
And that's why I summed that up as like prophecy is poison.
Yeah, that's great.
Because he is this, I mean, he's a bullfrog full of poison by the end of this.
Right. And
he's so negative.
There's so much bitterness and still
acidic.
desperation.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So that was my main takeaway.
Yeah.
The other thing, and this is the one I'm most excited about. This is why I really wanted to do this episode about this.
Okay.
The greatest change in this rendition of Macbeth is not anything we've talked about in the previous 46 minutes.
Great.
It is Ross.
Ross. Okay. See, here's the thing,
I know.
Cam.
I'm going to explain who it is.
I've read this play 2 or 3 times. I do not remember Ross being in this play.
Right, because he's not that much.
I was like, who is Ross? Like, I was reading the IMDb. I was like, I don't even know who that is.
So the actor, and I'll explain the character in a second, but I have a connection to the actor, who's Alex Hassel, who I saw play Hal in both parts of Henry IV in at the Royal Shakespeare Center.
Yep.
And he was incredible. He was the young, like, rebel upstart, and he had this like kind of floppy brown hair, and he was very young and handsome and in his prime and buff, but it was a great like tortured, earnest, ambitious performance. Here he's, I don't know, 8 years older. He's still very like fit, and he's got like a big strong jaw.
He's very trim.
But they dress him like Littlefinger.
Yes, he's wearing this like vaguely monkish costume, but it's much tighter and more.
He's got an extremely cropped beard and a buzz cut, basically, with very dark hair, which does stand out in a black and white performance.
I got a lot of queer energy from him. I really liked it. The way they dressed him and stuff, he was like this like conniving little gay man. I liked it a lot.
And the character he was playing, who's called Ross, is basically a lieutenant to Macbeth. So a lieutenant to a lieutenant. He's not monstrously important.
Okay.
But by the end, he becomes a lieutenant under the next guy. And he serves Macduff's friend.
And he does a lot of
Malcolm.
the scheming in the whole play.
Well, this is the adjustment.
Okay.
Because he has none of that in the play.
Well, that's what
This
I
is
thought.
the adjustment.
I was like,
right.
I don't remember this
So
character.
let me walk you through it, because
Okay.
I want to compare this to what Justin Kurzel did in his version of Macbeth, which was in 2015. That one was Michael Fassbender and Marion Cotillard. It's fantastic.
Oh, yes. It was a movie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Very, very different. It's
Love that
it's on HBO Max right now. If you have that, go watch
nice.
it. And that version opens with a shot of a child's grave. And it presents Macbeth and Lady Macbeth as young, grieving parents who are already torn apart and kind of splitting off from each other as the story begins.
Which is a diversion from the original text where they don't seem to have any kids.
Right. I think historically they might have.
I'm sure they did. Most people did.
But here you don't have the children part of it.
Yeah.
But there is something interesting in having like 60-year-olds as Macbeth and Lady Macbeth without kids.
Yeah.
There's something in there.
Yeah, so it's like, what happened? Why don't they have kids?
It becomes very like House of Cards.
Yes.
Where it's like Frank and Claire devote themselves to this evil political game at the expense of having a family.
Yeah.
And there is some of that inherited here. But the thing that sets this version apart, in the same way that Gravestone did for the Kurtzel version, for me, that is what they do to Ross here.
Okay.
Because he gets a promotion, basically, as a character.
Yeah.
He goes from being a guy in the background of diplomatic shots to, like I said, Littlefinger. Mm-hmm. And like we talked about before, all of these changes are done in between the lines, in between the verses. They don't change the text for this. What they do, and this means that either Joel Coen was really good at Macbeth, or whoever the dramaturg was for this production was really into Macbeth. Because they capitalize on so many perfect ambiguities in Macbeth, and I have some examples there. Macbeth meets with some murderers, some cutthroats that he's going to hire to go kill Banquo and Fleance, so that the prophecy doesn't come true. Mm-hmm. And I went back and read through that scene today because I knew it, but I just want to make sure, so I didn't make an ass out of myself here.
Yeah.
In the stage direction, he meets with 2 murderers. Mm-hmm. And they have that in this the Denzel Washington version of the story. He meets with 2 cutthroats.
Yeah.
But then, this is Act 2, Scene 3, opens with the stage direction. This is as the murderers watch Fleance and Banquo approach. Mm-hmm. The stage direction mentions 3 murderers. Mm. And that ambiguity I've always loved.
I remember you writing a paper about this many moons ago.
Because I wrote a paper about this, wondering who you could make that third murderer. Because, of course, the traditional interpretation is it's just another cutthroat, right? If she hired 2, they had another one, it's a big job.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
They need someone to kill the horse while they get the guys, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But I thought it would be fun if you make it one of the witches. Mm-hmm. Like they were making sure that the job was botched. Yes. Because their prophecy would require Fleance to survive.
The prophecy, yeah.
So I always thought it would be fun to have one of the witches in there. Mm-hmm. Or, because Macbeth's assistant in the very, very end of the play, the one he shouts out to, who then comes over and tells him that Lady Macbeth is dead, is named Satan.
That's right.
It's spelled differently, but it's named Satan, and it's phonetically Satan.
How is it spelled? Do you remember?
S-A-E-Y, I think. Satan.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's how it's pronounced, even in this version with the American accent, which I appreciated.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe you're throwing that in there, expanding some of the supernatural theological stuff, physicalizing some of that interpretation.
As in Satan is the third cutthroat?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Like that would be what would be required for an assassination of a child. You know?
Right, yeah.
You could play with that. There are versions of Macbeth, stage versions, where the witches are on stage the whole time.
Yep.
Very much like working the machinations of the story.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And that kind of furthers that spider analogy I made earlier. But this version of the story makes the third murderer Ross.
Yes.
Where
Which is
he's
so
there
cool.
scheming, because he doesn't have a couple lines of dialogue. So they just give those to Ross. Because all it says in the stage direction of the play is third murderer.
Okay.
And here they just give it to Ross. So he's like scheming with them.
Very cool.
And then they botch the murder. Fleance gets away. And then later on, after the 2 murderers leave, and again, they are working in between the verses. They're not adding a thing to the text.
Yeah.
It's the most respectful way to diverge from the original version of the story.
As far as I know, they didn't add any dialogue. They maybe took things away, spliced things together, but
Joel Coen said they took out some of the more arcane references to things, like Greek mythology.
Yeah,
they simplified a little of that, but you don't lose anything without that, because they're not things people get anyway now.
Right.
But plot-wise, they didn't change anything except Ross. So after the murderers are gone, Ross hunts down Fleance silently and finds him. And hides him away with this old man who's like the witch, which is a whole other weird,
what's going on with
funky
that?
Adaptation.
Well, I mean, you could read that like you were saying before, as it's the witch making sure that the prophecy is carried out, making sure that Banquo's child becomes king later.
Because a lot of versions of this story have, like a lot of televised versions and movie versions, have Fleance reappear at the end, because most movies don't kill kids or dogs. It's sort of the same
I don't think it's even that. I think it's the prophecies all come true.
I guess, but I again, in the original text, I adore the ambiguity that yes, he got away, but we don't know anything after that. because that suggests, like, if the witches are an active form of God, basically, where they are making prophecies and then involving themselves so that those prophecies are carried out, you almost trust that there's another witch somewhere making sure Fleance will meet the right guy and become a king.
Right.
I like that, like, gesture at how wide the world is, and shit, there are more of these things out
like
there.
we don't need to see it. Yeah.
But instead, you have Ross hunt down Fleance, and at the very end of the play, or at the very end of this movie version, Fleance does reappear, but it's when Ross goes to find him and quote-unquote rescue him. That's how I read that.
Right, but he is on a horse with Fleance, and they just ride down this hill, and then they're out of view, and then what? A raven comes out, and that's it? So what, he took him into the underworld? That's what I saw. I didn't know what to make of it.
I don't know. I think it was... I thought that was just a way of fading to black with the birds. Like, that was the fulfillment of the prophecy.
Or could you read, Ross goes down this hill out of sight, like out of shot, basically. The hill is blocking him from view. The raven comes out. Ross is actually one of the witches.
No, I don't think so. Yeah. Because Ross going back and rescuing Fleance, he kind of threatens him when he puts him on the horse with him. He's very cold. The way he talks to him. It's not like, oh, I just...
Hey, buddy.
Hey, buddy, I'm your new uncle. We're going to go meet some friends.
It's going to be okay.
It's like, don't tell anyone I hid you in the weird shack in the woods. I'm the guy who found you. I'm now your new daddy savior. That's how I read that.
Okay.
Which makes sense because in the previous scenes, after... Like, he's the guy. Ross is the guy who carries Macbeth's head out. Right. Every version I've ever seen of Macbeth, that is Macduff.
Of course, because he's the one
guy
who
just killed him with a sword.
He's victorious. He defeated Macbeth, right?
Here it's Ross. Yeah. So he is very much schmoozing his way into the new regime. And then we see him, like, accepted into Malcolm's new enclave.
Malcolm, yeah.
So he is a worm. He is Littlefinger jumping from king to king.
Oh, yeah.
As, like, I am the indispensable chief of staff that you need here. Oh, the other guy, I didn't like him at all. I was always just here for you.
Right.
The implication at the end is he runs back, grabs Fleance from the shack in the woods, and then brings him back as, like, a gift to prove that he was always on the side of Malcolm.
Oh, like, see, I kept him
this guy.
safe. Okay, that's cool, too. I like that.
Which, like, makes sense for Ross being yet another schemer in this world, but it also means that the prophecy will be fulfilled.
Yeah.
Well, at least that Fleance has survived, and now we're bringing him to a king.
Yes.
We can assume by some...
He will become king.
Eventually he'll become king.
Uh-huh.
But that does suggest that Ross is part of the witch's plan. Because Ross, who's another, like... shithead schemer, he's the one who fulfills the witch's plan.
Right.
Which would suggest that his terrible actions are sanctioned.
Well, and having him wearing a vaguely religious-looking outfit ties him to the supernatural, especially when these witches, like you were saying, are acting as God in this story. Like, not that there is no Christianity in the canon of the story, because obviously there is, but... for this plot, they're the ones playing God, so having him in a vaguely monk-looking outfit ties him to that supernatural. And she's, the witch is wearing this big cloak thing, so that makes a lot of sense.
But it suggests that not only is the world purely made up of schemers, but that sometimes they win, and sometimes that's part of the plan. Or it serves a higher purpose. It's pretty bleak.
Yeah.
But I love what they did with this character.
Oh, me
I think
too.
it is by far the standout interpretive moment they have with this text. And Alex Hassel, for me, steals the movie.
Yeah,
I think he
was
is just
so good.
Fantastic in this.
I wanted him to play Macbeth.
But in the same way, I was excited to see Ralph Ineson as like, oh, yeah, this is an A24. This is my kind of A24 movie, which is already such a catered subsection of movies.
What character was Ralph Ineson? Do you know the name
I don't
of the character?
remember.
Okay.
He
I know it's a very
Duncan.
small character.
Yeah, I don't remember the name.
Okay.
But having Alex Hassel in this means that you are looking at the preeminent stage actors in London of the time and bringing those into your movie. Again, it is demonstrating a respect for the source material.
Yeah,
And there's nothing that matters more to me in Shakespeare versions. It's that, and then what funky angle can you play on the original text? They do two birds with one stone here. And the very last point I have to wrap this whole little discussion up into a bow, Ross kills Lady Macbeth.
That's right, he does. You don't see it, right?
No,
but
because
it's heavily
once again,
implied.
It's in between the verses.
Right, we are not taking over the text.
So from Ross's perspective, you see a totally out of it, possibly sleepwalking Lady Macbeth standing at the top of these really steep marble stairs.
Yes.
You see him see her like that.
Yep.
Then the action goes to some other hectic thing over there, and then we cut back of the same shot of the stairs, and she's dead at the bottom of it.
Right.
So it's very strongly, to me at least, implied that he went and just pushed her.
Yes.
And he killed her, which would make him, I think that does elevate him to the level of the witches for controlling what happens
exactly.
here.
He's playing an active role in the outcomes of everything happening here. Makes a lot of sense.
That makes him the highest level schemer. And then he kills Lady Macbeth, and then he's the one carrying Macbeth's head. That is the biggest promotion I've ever seen a side character get in an adaptation of Shakespeare. It is fantastic.
Yeah,
his performance is so good.
I would love to watch this again and watch him more closely and just dig into it and give Denzel's performance another chance, because I really wanted to like it. So I will say his more dramatic moments, like with Banquo, like the ghost of Banquo, and when he's fighting Macduff, like the contrast between that and the subtleness of the rest of his performance was really good. I didn't mind that his performance was restrained. I liked that. I thought it worked really well with the way this whole movie was done, but it was just his like specific recitation. I could see him reciting lines and not speaking his character's words.
I mean, that's just, I believe you. I saw them as a man's thoughts, that he was almost muttering them to himself.
Sure.
I really loved the way he did it, but great version
of
Macbeth.
I don't mean to like this. This was a great movie
and a great addition to this like cinematic catalog of Macbeth performances,
and refreshing to see a Macbeth performance that is not typical. You know, like I've seen, other ones that are more standard but great, but it's nice to have a change at this, 500 years later. It's nice when they shake things up.
So A24, if you're listening, hire me to do Dr. Faustus in this style. Or you can email us, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com or secondbreakfastpod on Instagram. And we will be back on Friday with more Tolkien as we wrap up Return of the King.
Let us know if you've seen this movie. What did you think?
Look it up. See if there's a showing near you. I think it's towards the end of the month that this will be coming out normally in theaters.
Okay.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah, it was great. I'd love to see it again. This is one I want to own and watch all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Man, I forgot how much I want to see a play so bad.
There's nothing I like talking about more than Shakespeare.
I think the last live theater performance I saw pre-pandemic was a version of Macbeth. We saw it in New York. It was like it was an all-female cast, and they were at like private school. Like it was like college girls in this performance.
They were awesome.
It was so interesting, like all female cast. I mean, they didn't change any of the pronouns or the names. They just went for it. Yeah. It was really cool. Anyway, that was an awesome production. Anyway,
the wonderful thing is, in the same way Shakespeare is so dynamic and human and universal, if you make any sort of demographic changes to the cast, you don't need to change the text.
Exactly.
It will flex to change the energy and dynamics of it. It is,
yes,
it's made of
believed
rubber.
It completely. Like, it's not like it was female characters playing male characters.
And
it was just, or actresses, but it was just, it worked. Because that's the thing about Shakespeare's text, is it's so dynamic, it's so moldable that you don't need to make those changes.
I mean, you cast anyone. You can
literally
swap
cast
any role.
I saw an old woman play Richard III. It was amazing.
And
I
it
loved
gives it a distinct flavor. It doesn't change anything for the worse. It's just a different version.
Totally.
And what I love so much about Shakespeare and Marlowe, because Marlowe's better, Faustus is the best.
They're contemporaneous, same time period.
Marlowe was first and better.
I'm just saying,
paved the way for Shakespeare.
Same-ish time.
But the wonderful thing I love about those is how many times you can see them and how many different versions there can be. How much you can wring out of a text 400 years later.
5.
It's just startling.
Yeah.
So
incredible. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Yep. See you Friday.
See you on Friday.
Tuesday.